Where do you and Mercato see opportunity right now when we talk about AI? A lot of people are focused on Mag 7, but there's a
Hmm.
whole world of opportunity that's not direct with the chip makers or the companies that actually are creating AI. Where do you see the opportunity?
One of the big veins of opportunity from our point of view is infrastructure. So, in infrastructure, a big chunk of infrastructure is energy, and the energy that's required to power the future of AI in the United States. The estimate is somewhere between 150 to 170 gigawatts of power are required in the United States over the next 10 years. And to give you a frame of reference of how much new power that equates to, an average size natural gas plant is 500 megawatts. So we're talking about 30 of those that starting today. And the typical natural gas power plant takes about 5 years to go from breaking ground to commissioning.
So with all of the demand for AI growing and growing, I think I saw a headline recently that said, "Get ready for blackouts." Do you? I mean, I don't know your knowledge of the energy grid in the space, but do you see that happening, and will that accelerate the opportunities in what you've just described?
It definitely should, Adam. So to give you some frame of reference from my point of view, I was one of the early employees and helped take a company here in Utah public called Vivint Solar, really the groundbreaking company for residential solar in the United States. So the challenge today is twofold. One, the power generation problem we just talked about, but the second is it's not just a generation problem. Like one of the great constructs of mankind is the power grid in the United States. And the reason for that is electricity has to stay in constant supply demand balance 24/7, or you have two problems. One is rolling blackouts, a la what Spain and Portugal just went through a couple of weeks ago. Or at the other end of the spectrum, you waste power. Because if supply is greater than demand, the utility has two options. If they let it go all the way to the outlet, it burns up whatever's connected to it. So what they do instead of that is just run that excess electricity right into the ground. So it's wasted. So there's two things that have to be solved for. One is just the power generation, and the second is keeping that supply demand in constant balance. And that's an interesting opportunity for AI actually to solve AI's power problems. And this is a space where we've already invested in a company called Porus, that is a combination of a flywheel technology, an inertial power storage system coupled with AI to enable that constant supply demand balance.
We hear a lot when we talk about power. There was the big deal that Meta announced 2 weeks ago, where they're going to help keep a nuclear power plant going in Illinois. And they don't need all the power that comes from that plant, but they'll get part of that. Where do you see the fastest, perhaps, return on investment? You were successful with the solar company you mentioned earlier, but for an average investor, would it make sense to be looking at the nuclear options, the natural gas options, or are there other options out there to consider?
The two quickest to market opportunities are using assets that already exist. So either refurbing nuclear power or natural gas. So no new technology needed to be developed, just keep turning them on, refurbing them, and getting that power onto the grid. The interesting thing that a lot of the data center owners and operators are doing is getting clean tech somewhere in the country, even if it's not a direct supply into the data center, getting that stood up and then using whatever maybe it is fossil fuel based power to feed into the nuclear to the data center. So from a carbon standpoint, net they are reducing carbon. Longer term, though, say at the second half of that 10-year horizon, solutions like small modular reactors and geothermal begin to make a lot of sense. And in fact, both Meta and the Bill Gates have recently invested in some geothermal production here in the Rocky Mountain area.
In fact, when we talk about the geothermal opportunity, are there companies, I don't know if you're allowed because of compliance issues, but can you tell me as an investor, are there publicly traded companies I should look at? A previous guest talked about, for instance, with nuclear, Oklo. But are there companies that investors should consider that we don't know because we're not in this space?
So geothermal is not a new concept, but the construct that is being deployed for here in the Rockies for data centers is something called a closed loop system. That's a relatively new construct. And the two startups that are grabbing lots of headlines are called Fervo as well as Sage. And unfortunately, they're still privately held.
Yeah, but you could get in on them if you had access to private market investing services, correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, for example, Bill Gates is one of the primary investors behind Fervo today.
I spoke to someone not too long ago, though. Private market investing options for lay people can be as little as 25,000, but usually you're talking about 250 and high, 250,000 and
Yeah.
higher. When we talk about this demand for energy, could you see a slowdown in AI because of a inability to meet the demand for power?
It's certainly possible. I think there's a lot of options and work being done to offset that. So interesting, Adam. An interesting fact is over the last 12 months, the price that the average American pays for power to the utility has gone up by 4.5%. So it has exceeded the inflation rate significantly. So lawmakers, legislatures at the state level around the country are trying to tackle this in various ways. In Texas, for instance, lowering the level of regulation even further. Here in Utah, the state government has told both the data center owners as well as the utility, whatever you do, you can do whatever you want behind the meter. It just cannot impact the homeowner's bills. And so that's a different way of tackling the problem. But I think it's this public-private partnership at a certain level that has to happen to enable the right level of power to come online to support AI without it being sort of passing the buck to the homeowner.
Do you know of any utilities, when we talk, for instance, nat gas, that are actually ramping up their ability to produce electricity via nat gas plants in order to meet this demand? Or do you know of any utilities that are ramping up already conventional methods of generating electricity that might have a 1 to 2 or even 3 year time horizon, as opposed to the 10-year that we talk about with those smaller nuclear plants and even bringing some of the older plants back online?
Absolutely. So around the country, I think Exelon just did a deal with Microsoft, I believe, to bring a significant amount of power back online. Here in the Rockies, Pacific Corp is leaning very forward in bringing both production online as well as storage online to offset or to keep up with the AI power needs. I think it's interesting, Adam. One of the coming from a solar background, but one of the challenges that solar creates is kind of twofold. First, it produces power at very specific times of day, to state the obvious. But the second is there's something in the industry called clean power. And what that means is what clean power is running across our grid is 60 hertz. It has to be precisely 60 hertz. And how traditional power plants achieve that is they have inertial power. So think about a wheel spinning of some sort, or gears spinning in a certain way. That enables that power that ultimately goes onto the grid to be right at 60 hertz. This is a drawback of renewable power, is there is not an associated gear mechanism to clean that power and make sure when it goes onto the grid, it's right at 60 hertz. So those two challenges are something that a lot of utilities face that have an installed base of renewable power on their portion of the grid. And it's something that utilities like Pacific Corp are pretty focused on today.
I am no electrical engineer, but you brought this up earlier, in fact, that you are invested in a startup that deals with it. How did you refer to it? The inert.
Yes, inertia. So essentially, the company's called Taurus, but essentially what inertia is just think about a spinning wheel, some
Right.
way of spinning wheel. So like at a natural gas powered plant, it'll at the end of a turbine. It has a turbine that's spinning, and
Right.
that power, the explosion that occurs that causes the power, spins that wheel, and then that wheel pushes the electricity onto the grid.
Hmm.
That's how a natural gas power plant, solar, wind, they don't have any sort of mechanism like that. So a company like Taurus will connect to those power generation assets and bring their own spinning. They have a flywheel technology, so
They're,
they actually
they create a kind of electric middle. I don't
yes,
want to say middleman, but middle thing
exactly,
to slow down the
exactly.
process and to regulate. But does it allow for storage, or does the electricity essentially eventually has to be put out?
Well, the beauty of flywheel technology, and there's two things as it relates to data center, but the beauty of flywheel technology is it does provide that cleansing capability, but it also has storage capability. It is it's a thing of beauty from a physics standpoint. That there's that flywheel is kept in constant motion by the electricity. There is nothing touching the flywheel other than a couple ball bearings at the bottom. And that enables you to have a low loss storage mechanism. And then when the grid needs that electricity, it is then pulled onto the grid. The other interesting thing that flywheels do for data centers is flywheels can operate as something like a supercapacitor, meaning when data centers need electricity, they need it in milliseconds. So if you think about a power plant, you want a power plant sort of producing at a constant level. But when a data center begins to train a model, they'll have data spikes, and then
Mhm.
when a particular model stops training, it'll have a data lull, a power lull. And so what a flywheel can do is act as a supercapacitor and push that electricity on instantaneously to match those spikes and troughs.
So for lay investors, that's how I would describe myself. You have expertise because you've been doing this for many years. What are the questions if someone's looking at these different potential opportunities, whether they're going to go in through a private market fundraising situation or if they were a publicly traded uh, entity? What should people be asking before they put their money down?
I think there's two fundamental questions, Adam. The first is what's the total cost of ownership of that power source, from building it to decommissioning it and everything in between. And then the second is more of a frankly a political issue that we find ourselves in. How many of those sources, power or components of the power plant are required from foreign resources? So, for instance, when we talk about nuclear, obviously it's powered by uranium. And no matter what anybody says or any hand waving, for a nuclear power plant to work, 99.999% of nuclear it uses some version of uranium, and most of it does not come from the United States. The good news is most of the uranium that we use comes from Canada. So if we can continue to be good trade partners with Canada, we can have access to uranium. Another form of power that has been thrown about, at least theoretically, for decades is fusion. Fusion is run on magnets, and we know that magnets are rare earths that come from China. So that's a holdback. So I think that at the end of the day, what is the power source and where do the components, where do they come from? That is the great thing about fossil fuels and particularly natural gas powered facilities is it's domestic.
So there were two opportunities you just brought up. Let's talk about commodities, uranium. Hasn't the price of uranium been shooting up as there is this need for clean nuclear
Absolutely.
power?
Yes, that's spot on, Adam. And again, not only is it spiking up because of demand, but it's spiking up because the sources of where the uranium comes from. it comes from most of the United States consumed uranium comes from Canada, but so it's Canadian, where we're now talking about tariffs, et cetera, and the Canadians are like, that is their negotiating lever is to hold back uranium from the United States. It comes from China, it comes from Russia, like sources where we have real trade conflict today, hence why it's going up.
Do we have uranium sources that we can, leverage in the United States, or because of our regulations, we no longer do that?
It's the sourced uranium in the United States is a very small percentage of consumption today, single digits.
Have we depleted our sources though?
I don't think so, but I think it is like low single digits of how much the United States consumes. I think there are two mines in the United States today. Frankly, one's here in Utah, and the other is, I think, in Nevada.
Okay. Now, what about rare earths? Because many years ago, and well, not many, 5 years ago when I was at Yahoo, we interviewed, I believe he was the CEO of a new company that was planning to mine rare earths, and there's huge stockpiles of rare earths. They've just announced discoveries here in the United States. Why are we not exploiting those? Any idea?
That is a great question. In fact, Utah has 40 of the 50 rare earths here that are now being mined. It's a great question, Adam. I think part of it is we don't have the full spectrum of rare earths in the United States at the quantum that we need. The other thing is, like any heavy industry, it takes time to set up the ability to mine from standstill when we're going from, well, we'll just get them cheaply from China to now that's cut off and potentially cut off and need to source it domestically. But I think this is from a longer term horizon. I think finding alternatives to those names on today's rare earth list, finding synthetics and other alternatives, that is a tremendous and long-term investment opportunity.
Is Mercato investing in anybody who's doing either the alternatives or the traditional just rare earths?
Not today, but always on the hunt.